Welcome to the Secret Traditions podcast, where ancient wisdom meets modern minds.
All right, let's dive into something pretty mysterious and intriguing, Jung's 7 Sermons to the Dead.
Yeah, the context surrounding these sermons is fascinating. They weren't just like random thoughts, They came from a period of deep introspection for Jung, a deep dive into his own unconscious, which he documented really carefully in his journals, the Black Books.
And those Black Books eventually became the legendary Red Book, right? The one that he kept secret for decades, only sharing it with just a few people. It adds this whole layer of mystery to the 7 Sermons, don't you think?
Absolutely. Jung saw the Red Book as something super personal, and he didn't publish it while he was alive. But the 7 Sermons, he actually had those printed privately back in 1916, and he even shared copies with some of his friends and students.
So for this deep dive today, we're going to focus on the first 2 sermons. They introduce this mind-bending concept of the pleroma, and they explore the origins of creation.
It's a concept that really challenges the way we normally think. The pleroma is described as the totality of everything, the absolute. It exists beyond all the categories and limits that we usually perceive. Imagine a state where fullness and emptiness are both there at the same time, where all opposites become one.
It's like trying to understand something that's impossible to understand.
Yeah.
The sermons start with this dramatic scene of dead souls coming back from Jerusalem. They're looking for answers from Jung. Well, actually, the voice speaking through him.
Yeah.
And right away, they're confronted with this idea of the pleroma.
Yeah, even trying to explain the pleroma is hard because when we put it into words, we risk losing its essence. It's like a dissolving that the sermon calls dissolution.
Okay, so the pleroma is this ultimate oneness, this boundless everything and nothing. How does anything actually come to be? How does creation happen from this state?
That's where differentiation comes in. It's like something within this perfect unity wants to separate, to distinguish itself, to become something distinct.
So are we as individuals like little pieces of the pleroma constantly trying to define ourselves? Is that where Jung's idea of the principle of individuation comes in? I remember that from my psychology studies, but it feels so much deeper in this context.
Exactly. Jung saw this drive towards individuation as this fundamental force inside of us, this urge to become a unique individual. And it all comes from this process of differentiating from the pleroma.
It makes you think, if we're all part of this cosmic dance of differentiation, how much of our individuality is really ours and how much is controlled by this force we're not even aware of? It's humbling, isn't it?
It is, and this differentiation is what leads to the pairs of opposites that we see in the world. Good and evil light, and dark masculine and feminine. But here's the thing, the sermon says, these opposites don't really exist in the pleroma. They only become a problem when we get attached to one side and forget that they're connected.
It's like those optical illusions where you can see 2 different images depending on how you look at it. Both images are there, but we usually focus on just one speak.
Could you give an example of how this clinging to one side of the opposites happens in real life?
Think about political polarization. People become so stuck in their own beliefs, so sure that they're right, that they can't see the bigger picture. They forget that both sides, even though they seem opposed, are part of the same system.
It's a trap that's easy to fall into, isn't it? Whether it's politics, personal relationships, or even our own struggles, we tend to see things as black and white. We forget that the truth is often somewhere in between.
And the sermon suggests that this habit of clinging to one side of the opposites comes directly from us being separated from the pleroma. We lose sight of the unity that's underneath everything.
So how do we get out of this track? How do we reconnect with that feeling of wholeness? That's a question that Jung spent a lot of time exploring. But in the 7 Sermons, the first step is recognizing that it's our very nature as being separated from the pleroma that causes this tendency. It's not about ignoring the opposites, but understanding that they're connected.
All right, let's go to the second sermon where the dead souls ask a question that's so important to being human. Where is God?
And this is where things get really interesting. The God they're talking about here isn't the traditional God of organized religion. The sermon describes God as a force coming from the pleroma, a specific quality called effective fullness.
So it's not the image we often have of a bearded figure on a cloud. This God is more like a principle, a force coming from the pleroma.
Exactly. And here's where it connects back to individuation. Just like we as individuals come from the undifferentiated state of the pleroma, so does this idea of God. It's another step away from that ultimate unity.
It's almost like creation is this ongoing process of moving away from unity towards differentiation. And if God appears as this effective fullness, does that mean there's also an opposing force, something like a devil that also appears?
You got it. The sermon brings in the devil in the same way, describing it as a force that represents effective emptiness. And here's the key, both God and the devil are needed. They both come from the same source, the pleroma.
This really challenges the usual idea of good versus evil, doesn't it? Instead of seeing them as completely opposite, the sermon suggests they're two sides of the same coin, both necessary for creation to unfold. It's a big change in perspective.
It is. And this idea that opposites depend on each other is something you see a lot in Jung's work. It makes you think that our attempts to categorize and separate things into neat boxes might be more about our limited human perception than about how reality actually is.
So how does this understanding of God and devil, of effective fullness and effective emptiness, relate to our own lives? Are we constantly in this back and forth between these forces?
That's something worth thinking about. Maybe instead of trying to suppress one or the other, we can learn to see how they work together within us and try to find a balance between these seemingly opposite forces.
It's a lot to take in, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But it feels like we're only just beginning to understand this.
We are. And the sermons go even deeper. They introduce this even more mysterious force called abraxas. But that's a conversation for another time.
I'm already intrigued. For our listeners, what would you say is the most mind-blowing thing from these first two sermons? What should they be thinking about as we go forward?
I'd say the most amazing concept is the idea of the pleroma as the source of everything, a unity that's beyond what we can understand. And within that unity, even forces that seem opposite, like God and the devil, are actually connected. They come from the same source. It makes us rethink how we see duality and maybe embrace a more complete view of reality. It definitely does challenge our usual way of thinking. And that leads us to this even more mysterious force you mentioned, abraxas. In the third sermon, that dead souls, they're so eager for knowledge, they keep asking the voice for details about this supreme God.
And it seems like they get more than they expected. The sermon describes Abraxas as the God who is difficult to know. It says his power is truly supreme. Even the way they talk about Abraxas suggests a force that's beyond our understanding.
The reason abraxas is so hard to grasp is that it goes beyond our usual way of thinking in opposites. We like to categorize things as good or evil, light or dark, but abraxas has both sides.
So it's not just a balance between good and evil. Abraxas is the source of both. It's like the origin of all these opposing forces.
Exactly. The sermon describes abraxas as the indefinable life, the mother of good and evil alike. Even more powerful than the godson because it's the source of that life force itself.
Okay, my brain is trying to do a backflip to understand this. If Abraxas is the source of everything, what does that even look like? The sermon must use some pretty wild imagery to try and explain this.
It does. The sermon describes abraxas as the sun and also the eternally gaping abyss of emptiness, the devourer and disintegrator, the devil. It's an image that makes you feel both awe and terror. It's a force of huge power that can create and destroy.
That's a powerful image. It
Yeah.
sounds almost scary to even think about. Is this something we should be afraid of?
Not necessarily afraid, but definitely aware of its power and complexity. The sermon even says, to see him means blindness, to know him is sickness, to worship him is death, to fear him is wisdom, not to resist him means liberation. It suggests that trying to understand abraxas can change you, but it can also be overwhelming.
It reminds me of that saying, if you stare into the abyss long enough, the abyss stares back at you. It feels like Abraxas is something that can challenge our whole understanding of reality. Maybe even break it apart.
That's a great comparison. Abraxas represents everything that exists, the never-ending cycle of creation and destruction. It's a force that works beyond our usual ways of understanding.
Okay, let's change gears a bit and go to the fourth sermon, where the dead souls, always so curious, they want more information about gods and devils. They seem pretty insistent about this.
And the sermon gives it to them. It starts by acknowledging the godson and the devil as the main pair of opposites, but then it throws in a twist saying, there are, however, many great goods and many great evils.
So it's not just one god and one devil, it's saying there's a whole range of these forces.
Exactly. The sermon introduces two more god devils, the flaming one and the flourishing one. These represent different parts of the divine, each with its own special qualities and powers.
I'm interested. Tell me more about these new players in this cosmic drama.
The flaming one is linked to Eros, the god of passion and desire. So as you might guess, it represents fiery energy consumption and intense experiences. The flourishing one is connected to the tree of life, which symbolizes growth, abundance, and the gradual buildup of life energy.
So we have this contrast between bursts of energy and slow, steady growth. Both are needed for life, but they show up in very different ways. It's cool how the sermon uses these classic images to explain these complex ideas.
And just like with the godson and the devil, the sermon stresses that good and evil are mixed together in these forces too. It says, good and evil are united in the flame. Good and evil are united in the growth of the tree. It's a reminder that we can't completely separate these ideas. They're woven into everything that exists.
This makes those simple ideas of good and evil we often hear seem pretty naive. It's a much more realistic view.
It is, and the sermon takes it even further, saying that there are countless gods and devils as many as there are stars in the sky. Each star is a god, and each space between the stars is a devil. It's an amazing image that makes this cosmic story so much bigger.
So we're talking about a whole bunch of divine and demonic forces at work. How are we supposed to even start to understand this? It's almost too much.
The sermon actually warns us not to try to oversimplify everything into one god or one belief system. It says that when we do that, we distort the world, which needs diversity and the interplay of all these different forces.
So it's not about finding the one right answer or worshiping one main god. It's about accepting all these different forces and recognizing that they're all connected.
Exactly. The sermon points out that humans with our limited abilities need community to help us deal with these powerful forces. And just like there are many gods, there need to be many communities, each showing different aspects of the divine.
That's an interesting point. It's like each community might be drawn to a particular god or group of gods that match their values and worldview. And this diversity, instead of causing conflict, is actually needed for the whole thing to be healthy and strong.
Precisely. It's a view that encourages tolerance and understanding, recognizing that there are many ways to connect with the divine, many ways to express the pleroma.
Okay, let's move on to the fifth sermon, where things shift to something a little more personal, the church and the holy community. I'm curious to see how this fits into this bigger cosmic picture we've been talking about.
This sermon jumps right into the tricky relationship between spirituality and sexuality, two forces that are often seen as opposites, but in Jung's view are closely connected.
Whoa, didn't see that coming.
Yeah.
But it makes sense considering Jung's focus on how seemingly opposite forces interact within the psyche.
Exactly. The sermon suggests that both spirituality and sexuality are expressions of the divine, but in different ways. Spirituality is linked to the celestial gods, representing our connection to something beyond this world, while sexuality is connected to the earthly gods, representing our connection to the physical world and the life force that flows through it.
So we have this tension between heaven and earth, the spiritual and the physical playing out inside us. And it sounds like finding a balance between these forces is important.
It is. The sermon warns against focusing too much on one at the expense of the other, saying that this can create imbalance and actually slow down our spiritual growth.
So what's the right balance? Is there a formula for bringing these seemingly opposite forces together?
That's where it gets complicated. The sermon says that men and women experience these forces differently, almost like mirror images. Men are naturally drawn to spirituality, but their sexuality is more earthly and instinctual. Women, on the other hand, are naturally drawn to sexuality, but their spirituality is more celestial and intuitive.
Okay, I'm trying to understand this. So it's not about denying our natural tendencies, but understanding how these forces show up differently in each gender and respecting those differences.
Exactly. The sermon warns against men and women trying to fit into roles that don't match their natural inclinations. It's about embracing our own unique way of expressing these forces and finding a balance that feels true to ourselves.
This is definitely challenging some traditional ideas about gender roles and spirituality. It's a more nuanced view that acknowledges the differences between men and women while still saying it's important to find harmony between the spiritual and the sexual.
And the sermon goes on to highlight the importance of community in dealing with these powerful forces. It says that because humans are naturally weak, we need the support and guidance of others to help us find our way.
So community acts like a container, providing a safe and supportive environment to explore these parts of ourselves.
Yes, but the sermon also warns against becoming too dependent on community. It stresses the importance of solitude for self-discovery and inner growth.
That classic tension between the individual and the group comes up again. It seems like finding that balance between connection and being alone is key for spiritual development.
It's a recurring theme in Jung's work, and it speaks to how complex the human experience is. We're social beings who need connection, but we also need time alone to connect with our inner selves and develop our own relationship with the divine.
Okay, we're getting into some deep stuff here, and it feels like the sermons are building up to something even more profound. What awaits us in Sermon 6?
Get ready for some vivid imagery as the sermon introduces the serpent and the white bird, representing the demons of sexuality and spirituality.
Demons. Now, I'm really interested. So we have these animal archetypes representing different parts of the human psyche. The serpent symbolizes sexuality, and the white bird symbolizes spirituality.
Exactly. The serpent, described as a semi-human soul called thought desire, is connected to the earth and the world of the dead. It represents our primal instincts, our earthly desires, and the temptations that can lead us astray.
It sounds like the serpent in the Garden of Eden tempting Eve with the forbidden fruit. Is this serpent purely a bad thing?
Not necessarily. The sermon acknowledges that the serpent can be dangerous, but it also suggests that it can be helpful in surprising ways.
Helpful? How so?
The sermon says, though it does not wish to be so, it is useful to us. The serpent escapes us, we pursue it, and thus it shows us the way which, with our limited human wits, we could not find. It's almost as if the serpent, with its cleverness and its connection to hidden things, can guide us to truths we wouldn't find on our own.
It's like a tricky guide leading us through the dark, making us face our shadows, and eventually leading us to greater self-knowledge. It's an interesting paradox.
It is. And then we have the white bird representing the semi-celestial soul called desire thought. This bird, connected to the heavenly realm, brings messages from the divine from those who have reached a higher level of consciousness. It represents a pure kind of spirituality untainted by earthly desires.
So the white bird is like our connection to higher realms, our intuition, our inspiration. It's a symbol of going beyond ourselves and spiritual goals.
Exactly. The sermon emphasizes that both the serpent and the white bird are strong forces we need to be aware of. They can both lead us in the wrong direction or guide us to our true selves, depending on how we relate to them.
It sounds like we have to learn to dance with both of these demons, understanding their power and how they affect us. It's about finding that balance between the serpent's earthly wisdom and the white bird's spiritual guidance.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It's about bringing together these seemingly opposite forces within ourselves, recognizing that both are necessary for wholeness.
This is making me rethink everything I thought I knew about good and evil, about spirituality and sexuality. It's a much more complete and integrated perspective.
And remember, we're only on Sermon 6. There's still one more to go, and it promises to be just as thought-provoking.
I'm excited to see where this journey takes us next.
Yeah.
What did the dead souls ask about in the last sermon? What mysteries are still left to be uncovered?
They've asked about God devils the soul. Now they finally want to know about man himself. It's like the climax of their journey, a quest to understand not only the cosmos, but also their own place in it.
Yeah, it feels like we've been on this wild ride through all these cosmic ideas and these divine forces interacting with each other. And now in this last sermon, we're focusing on the creature that's trying to understand it all, us humans.
It's a fitting ending to our exploration. After diving into the mysteries of the pleroma, God, the devil, all these different forces, we've finally faced the question of where we fit in all of this.
And the sermon starts with a really strong image. Man is a gateway. A gateway to what exactly? It makes you want to know more.
It goes on to say, man is a gateway through which we pass from the outer world of God's demons and souls into the inner world, from the greater to the lesser world. Small and insignificant is man. Soon we leave him behind and enter once more into infinite space, into the microcosm, into inner eternity.
So are we supposed to understand that humans are like this bridge between these huge cosmic realms and our own inner world? Like we're standing at this crossroads of the outer and the inner, the macrocosm and the microcosm?
That's a great way to describe it. We have both sides within us, the vastness of the universe and the closeness of our own personal experiences.
It's kind of a contradiction, isn't it? The sermon calls humans small and insignificant, but it also says we're this important link between these huge dimensions.
It is a paradox, and maybe that's the whole point. Maybe our importance isn't about our physical size or power, but about our ability to connect these seemingly separate worlds.
And then the sermon talks about this solitary star and the one God of the solitary one. It feels like we're shifting from the cosmic to something much more personal. What's the meaning behind these images?
This is where the sermon gets into the idea of a personal connection to the divine. The solitary star represents each person's unique inner light, their own personal pleroma, you might say. And the one God of this solitary one suggests a direct, intimate relationship with the divine that's different for everyone.
So it's not about worshiping some distant God out there. It's about growing that inner connection, that spark of divinity we all have inside. It's a really empowering idea.
It is, and it fits with Jung's emphasis on individuation, on becoming a complete and integrated individual. This process isn't just about understanding ourselves, but also about developing our relationship with the divine however we see it.
And then comes maybe the most mind-blowing statement in the whole sermon. In this world, man is Abraxas. Wait, are we Abraxas? How can we as limited humans possibly be this force that includes all of existence?
It's not saying we're literally Abraxas, but it's saying we have the potential inside us to show the full range of its power, both good and bad.
Right.
We have the ability to shape our own reality, to create and destroy, to choose good or evil.
That's a huge responsibility. It means we're not just bystanders in this cosmic play. We have agency. And with that comes a deep responsibility for the choices we make and what happens because of them.
Exactly. And this understanding can be both freeing and scary. It means we have the power to make beautiful and meaningful things in our lives, but also the potential to cause pain and suffering to ourselves and others.
So how do we use this inner power, this connection with our solitary star, in a good way? The sermon must give us some guidance on this.
It does. It highlights the importance of prayer, but not in the usual way of asking a God for things. The sermon says, "To this one man should pray." Prayer increases the light of the star. It builds a bridge over death. It increases life in the microcosm.
So prayer here is more about developing that inner connection, making our relationship with the divine within us stronger. It's about nurturing our own inner light.
Exactly. And the sermon suggests that through this inner work, we can find meaning and purpose even when we face death and the uncertainty of the world. We create a sense of inner strength and resilience that helps us handle life's challenges with more wisdom and grace.
It's a powerful message of hope and empowerment. These sermons have been incredible. They've challenged our ideas about reality, the divine, and our place in everything.
It's been an exploration of such depth and complexity, and I think our listeners are ready now to continue this exploration on their own, to dig deeper into Jung's work and think about these profound ideas.
Absolutely. Any last thoughts you want to share with our listeners before we finish this deep dive?
I'd encourage everyone to think about the paradoxical nature of being human. We're both small and insignificant, yet we have the seeds of the divine inside us, the potential to express the vastness of the pleroma. How we choose to live, how we connect with ourselves and the world around us ultimately reflects that inherent duality.
That's a perfect way to end. It's a question that can stay with us long after this deep dive is over. It encourages us to look at our lives, our choices, and our understanding of the universe with a fresh sense of curiosity and wonder. So to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of Jung's 7 Sermons to the Dead. We hope it has sparked your imagination and inspired you to keep exploring the mysteries of the human psyche and the cosmos within and around us.